Welcome everybody. My name's Emma Stewart. I'm co-founder and chief exec at Timewise, and welcome to our latest webinar. The topic for today is our Timewise Flexible Jobs Index and the findings from our 2020 analysis. So just as a reminder, we do our index every year. It's our annual research that looks at the proportion of job vacancies that are advertised as flexible at the point of hire. It's now in its 6th year. Clearly, this is the first year that we have run this data through a pandemic and through a world where flexible working has turned on its head. Today's session, we have you for an hour. We will divide it into 3 parts. I'm going to start by presenting the headline findings from the index and also the implications. And then I am delighted to be joined by an expert panel to discuss those findings and the implications, and also their reflections of embracing flexible hiring and flexible recruitment. They are Neil Carberry, who is Chief Executive Officer of the Recruitment and Employment Confederation. We have Laura Thurston, who is the Group Recruitment and Talent Director at Lloyds Banking Group. And then we have Laura Amos, who is UK&I Head of Employer Brand for EY. So clearly there's something about being good at flexible hiring and being called Laura. Then we will, for the last 15 minutes or so of the session, be opening up to a Q&A. If you do have questions as we go through the presentation, please do put them in our Q&A function. I know you're all familiar with Zoom and various platforms now. And obviously, just from a housekeeping perspective, please can you keep on mute throughout the session. So that's what we're doing today. Just for those of you who are new to us in terms of Timewise, just to give you a little bit of a background, we are a social business. Next slide, please. We are a social business, and we are driven by a mission to ensure that everybody can get the flexibility they need in the workplace without compromising their careers. To achieve that, we do 3 things. We undertake research and campaigns to analyse the state of the flexible employment and vacancy market, and also to champion the benefits of flex. The second thing we do is we help employers through our training and consultancy to get better at flexible working and flexible hiring. And then the third thing that we do is that we help people who want their next job to be a good and flexible job to find one through our job site, Timewise Jobs, where we provide advice, support, and also access to flexible vacancies. So in terms of the index this year, just to give you a bit of context and background as to what we do, why we do it, before I move straight into the findings. So as I said, it's our 6th year, and we set up the index because we wanted to fill a data gap around not just how many people work flexibly, which is obviously government data that's collected annually, but how many job vacancies reference flexible or part-time working at the point of hire. We knew we needed to do this because anecdotally for many years, we've been aware that there is a gap, a disconnect between demand from people who want to work flexibly. We estimate 9 out of 10 of the population, even pre-pandemic, and the volume of quality flexible roles advertised in the market for them to be able to move into. And this matters because there's a gap, because there aren't enough good quality flexible jobs. It creates a real challenge for people who need flexibility when it comes to job mobility. So we know people stay locked out of work sometimes because they can't find a job that offers flex, but also flexible working can trap you, negotiate, and then you look up and you look out, and it's very hard to progress in work. This is an issue that has historically disproportionately affected women, but is increasingly affecting men. And in fact, it's an issue for all of us that care about diversity and inclusion in the workplace and for acquiring good quality talent, because as we know this year, but even previously, it affects people who also need to work flexibly, whether it's health reasons, care reasons, or age. But increasingly also younger people are looking and assuming that they will be able to work flexibly from day one. And that from day one is the critical piece here. So how we do it is each year we analyse around about 6 million vacancies, and we want to look at how many of those specifically reference flex in the vacancy, whether it's part-time, whether it's remote working, or whether it's flexible on staggered hours, start and finish times. We're delighted this year, I should say, that the index has been supported by EY, by Lloyds, by Aviva, and also by the REC. So it's really good to be introducing the findings. this is the data from this year. I'm just going to contextualize this for you. We will be talking to you about the ratio. We'll also be looking at the types of roles that are advertised flex this year, and we'll be looking at also where those roles are in the country and what kind of role types. The context for this year is clearly hugely different to any year we have ever run a flexible jobs index. So this year we tracked vacancy data from pre-lockdown, from pre-pandemic at the beginning of the year, during the initial lockdown period, and then as we've eased coming out the other side. So we've looked at vacancies across that period. And we have also clearly looked at a jobs market where vacancies have been decimated. So the first thing to say is the volume of vacancies we've looked at has been less than ever before, clearly. It's around about 2/3 of pre-pandemic levels, or rather less than 2/3. So there's less jobs to look at. And the other thing is, just for context, we recognise that there are huge challenges for all job seekers in this decimated jobs market, in addition to those who specifically need to work flexibly. The other thing is, this has also been a year of seismic change for how we have all worked. So we have, prior to a pandemic, data that shows that probably around about 6% of people worked remotely. Over this period, we have seen at its peak around half the population working remotely. So the key thing is, you would assume that because we're all fundamentally working completely differently, that would translate in terms of far more vacancies opening up to flex. So has that been the case? Well, as you will see from this data, unfortunately, no. So at the start of last year, we had 15% of job vacancies referencing flex at the point of hire, up from when we started the index about 10%. So it's been creeping up year on year. At the beginning of 2020, it had crept up a bit more, and it was up to 17%. So we then looked across the year to the end, and what you will see is we are now at 22% of job vacancies that reference flex at the point of hire. That's a 7% increase on last year, and it's more increase than we've seen in any year. However, it's still surprisingly low, we think, in the context of how we're all working. So we are seeing a gap getting bigger between how we work in the employment market effectively for flexible work and the market for flexible recruitment for jobs advertised as flex. It's even more out of kilter now than it has ever been before, and that is clearly a big concern. I'm now going to quickly take you through some of the initial findings, and then I'll talk about the implications. So findings by type of flex, if we can move to that. So you'll see the graph on the left shows that historically, part-time and generic statements on job vacancies around flexible, we're open to flexible working, have been the most popular. Of the jobs that we've looked at more broadly, we have clearly seen a spike in remote working. So all kinds of flexible working rose slightly this year, but working from home as an option on a job vacancy, as you would expect, has gone up disproportionately. It's actually doubled from 3.4% to 7.7%, but it's still only 7.7% of job vacancies. The chart on the right is also important because what it shows is, of those vacancies that reference the opportunity to work from home, actually over half have also stated that people will be, that organisations will intend for people to revert to offices once we come out of the side of the pandemic. Now, clearly, we're having a big debate at the moment, and we are all exploring hybrid working, and we all know that working in offices is a good thing. But what we also need to make sure of is, while we are considering going back to, we don't revert completely to type and take some of these things off of our job vacancies, some of these statements. Next, let me look at salary level. So I'll take you through. So in terms of flex by salary, so at what salary level do we see references to flexible working? There hasn't been much shift this year compared to other years. The trend is still the same, although we are concerned it's getting slightly worse. We see far more opportunities to work flex, and specifically part-time at the lower end of salary bands. And yet, when we think about higher level roles and higher salaried roles, we are seeing an increase in opportunities for flex coming through, but it's mainly remote. So the concern we have is that there's a rising split. We're sort of calling it kind of flex haves and have-nots. We have at the lower end of the vacancy and the salary bands for flexible working, mainly part-time work, which we know is the challenge when it comes to remote progression and issues, particularly in relation to the gender pay gap. And then what we're seeing at the top end is more remote being offered for higher salary levels. But also, as we all know anecdotally, some of the challenges around those remote opportunities are that the hours and the intensity of the work is getting bigger and bigger. So there's a concern here around the split, and there's a concern clearly that's also linked to the kind of roles that people do, which I will come on to. So when you start to look specifically at different role types, and just to flag, we don't look explicitly at sectors when we analyse vacancies, because we don't always advertise as a sort of sector, we advertise by the kind of role itself. But we've clustered it broadly into sectors. So when we look at different role types, we are starting to see a pattern that links to those rising inequalities, essentially between roles that are predominantly done on a frontline basis, where it is more challenging and complex to consider flexibility, and those roles that can be done remotely because they are office-based white-collar roles. So if we look at the trends specifically for this year, what's been really interesting is that there are some sectors that have definitely embraced flexible hiring far more, and are obviously really starting to translate some of the learnings from working differently into their hiring practices. I'll call out IT, for example, has moved from 18 to 27%. Finance has moved from 15 to 22%. HR as well has moved from 16 to 26%, and legal, which has moved from 16 to 22% as well. So there are some real shifts in certain industries, which is a really, really positive thing to note. At the other end of the spectrum, though, we are seeing industries not moving very much at all. And I'll just call out three. So engineering, construction, and manufacturing. Engineering is still 11%, construction at 12%, and manufacturing at 8%. That's only 8% of all job vacancies within manufacturing reference any form of flexible working or openness to at the point of hire for people into those roles. And again, just to call out from that perspective that we know frontline is challenging, but we also know that many of these industries continue, even in this current climate, to have skills issues. And they are also industries where there is, we know, a real gender issue. So there is a clear, specific opportunity here to consider both obviously how jobs are designed within those industries, but also if we want to attract a wider, more diverse talent into them, to be open to flexibility and to start to shift those recruitment practices even more. And then finally, I'm just going to touch on location, and then I'll come to the implications. So, so where in the country are you more likely to get a flexible job? Well, there hasn't been a huge amount of change in most areas. There's been a flattening off. Everywhere has increased slightly in relation to, obviously, a response to the pandemic this year. If you want to get a good flexible job, the best place in the country right now to get one is in the southwest. So above average at 26%. Again, in terms of thinking about why and what that might mean, our assumption is we know people are more spread out. We know travel is an issue. We know there is less availability of talent often in rural regions, and therefore there is probably a need to be more open to flexibility. Historically, London has been the worst area in the country to get a flexible job, or it has the lowest, I should say, ratio of job vacancies specifically referencing flexibility. Interesting, London is starting to catch up. And again, thinking through the implications of the year we've just lived through, we expect it probably is because a lot of roles in London, not all, but a lot, can be done remotely. There are some considerable concerns, obviously, around commuting and travel and density of population from a health perspective. And so probably the combination of those two things has started to catalyse more vacancies in London being open to flex. So that's a very broad canter through of the overall findings by looking at ratio, by looking at overall, and looking at salary, role type and location. I'm now going to come to just some quick reflections on what this means and what, from a Timewise perspective, we think employers can do about it. So what we can take from all this, as I said at the beginning, is there is clearly a widening between how we work when it comes to working flexibly, although recognising that what we're all doing now is, or many of us, is remote working, and that doesn't equate to flexible working. But there is a widening between how we are working and how we advertise roles and how we recruit when it comes to flexible working. And that gap between employment and recruitment practices, recognising we are in a very challenging recruitment market, but people are still hiring. That gap is both, we think, a missed opportunity for many businesses who have adapted to different ways of working, and also it's a concern. I think in terms of job seekers, clearly it's a huge concern. Job seekers, we know people who are falling out of work right now are facing significant challenges in terms of trying to re-enter the labour market. But our worry is that those who need to work flexibly are going to stay locked out of work for longer. They're effectively going to be flex-excluded, as we would say, from the labour market, because there are not enough of the vacancies that are available, only 22% that reference any form of flex. The other worry that we have from a diversity and inclusion perspective is that the biggest shift in, obviously, the ways that people can work in those job vacancies has been around remote. And yet what we're seeing and what we know is that, particularly when it comes to attracting diverse talent and being inclusive and looking at issues around well-being and health, we need to also be thinking about part-time work, particularly when it comes to thinking about people with caring responsibilities, people with health issues and older workers. So two concerns really: not enough in terms of ratio of overall flex vacancies, and also just a challenge around different types of flexibility. The other point I would make on the types of flexibility is part-time for demographics, but also when people work, when it comes to thinking about frontline industries, which I'll come on to in a sec. And clearly, in terms of the implications for businesses, again, we recognise you could argue that it's a sort of buyer's market out there, but we know that businesses still want to attract good talent. And we know that they are going to be missing out on a considerable proportion of the population who both need, but also now expect to work flexibly, and expect businesses to be open to that, and will want them to see that they are saying so. And if they don't say so, they may not necessarily be able to consider the role if it is something that they have to do. So absolutely, it's a concern about missing out on talent, and it's also, again, from an ED&I perspective, an issue when it comes to thinking about how you are presenting your brand to job seekers, and how important it is when we think about attracting a diverse talent pool or having a diverse shortlist, to try and address some of these structural barriers that actually stop diverse talent pools from applying for vacancies. In terms of what needs to happen, there are three things that we are recommending, and we will come in the panel discussion to talk about it even further. Many of you that we already work with are doing a lot of this, but we are recommending for many other firms who aren't embracing flexible hiring. The first and simple recommendation is to mirror what is happening in your workplaces within your recruitment practices. So if you're enabling people to work flexibly, say that you are open to flexible working from day one for people who need it. All the evidence suggests, pre-pandemic, as this data shows, 9 out of 10 roughly people wanted to work flex. Currently 6 out of 10 people do. Estimates suggest 13 million people are expecting, I think it's something like 70% of people are expecting to retain flexibility. So it's really important we think about that when we want to attract talent. Secondly is to consider all types of flex. So not just where we work, but how much, and also when we work, so that we can be as inclusive and fair in our approach when it comes to recruitment, and we can make sure we can attract that wider pool of talent. And then thirdly, just from a strategic perspective, to make sure that we include strategies around improving flexibility and flexible work and training managers in flexible job design within our ED&I strategies, within our wellbeing strategies, and that we start to take a proactive approach as opposed to a reactive approach. So a wider piece which we are learning from this crisis is that we are asking, and we are certainly seeing some businesses leaning into this and being really clear that they will start the conversation about flexibility, whether it's at recruitment or even whether it's for individual employees. So being, as we call it, flex positive, which reflects in our flex positive programme to make sure that you can do that. And then just lastly, two broader macro points. One in terms of thinking about job creation. From a government perspective, we are keen to see that any job creation schemes that come forward, because we need more vacancies, we need more roles created, are open to flexibility, and that anything that is commissioned in that space ensures that flexibility is an ask. And secondly, that policymakers in particular will provide signposting to guidance and support from organisations like us and many others who are able to support them to actually understand how to design jobs in a fair and flexible way, so that they can also adjust their recruitment practices. So that is a very quick summary of our findings. Our report is on our website. It's available. It was published yesterday. There was a lot of media interest in it. And please do read, and please absorb, and please do come to us if you have any further questions on it. But now I'd like to open up and bring our panel in so that we can have a discussion about the findings and also some reflections on the excellent work that they have been doing in the context of flexible hiring. Welcome. So welcome Neil from the REC, welcome Laura from EY, and welcome Laura from Lloyds. So we'll have two different lawyers. So Neil, can I start with you, please? So as an industry expert, obviously a recruitment expert, and prior to that, your time at the CBI, I'm really interested just in your reflections on the findings. Do they come as a surprise to you? And given what we know about what we need to do at a broader kind of labour market level, whose job do you think it is to actually address this challenge?
Well, that's a really good question, Emma, and good afternoon, everyone. Real pleasure to be here today. I think all major economic disruptions like the pandemic, they shake the tree a bit, and they give us both an opportunity as businesses to do things which are we do the things we know, and to do things which are new, as the pace. Everything that we've seen this year has been a direction of travel that we already knew was happening, accelerating and being amplified. So no surprises perhaps in the data, Emma, that we've seen the amount of flexible working go up. I suppose my big question is, are we as employers coping, i.e. we can do home working, so now we're doing home working, and then when the pandemic's over, we'll go back? Or are we thriving? Are we changing? Are we moving on? And you called out exactly the right thing, I think, in your presentation around to what extent is home working flexible working. And certainly I know my experience as an employer at the REC, we've got about 60 staff. I've got a third who absolutely hate it if I let them go back to the office. And I've got a third who will happily do it forever. But we also know, many of you on the call know, that your FDs are wandering around with pound signs in their eyes because rent in London and lots of major cities, Manchester, Newcastle, Glasgow, is really, really high. And maybe we don't need that office space that once we did. So I think a real challenge is to get all this back to the people, because it's going to be the people that matter. And I suppose the theme for this comment from me is really about how people enable our productivity and how engagement drives our growth as companies and employers. And that's only going to get more true. So you mentioned, Emma, that there were still skill shortages in some sectors. I absolutely see that. Let's remember that in macro terms, that tightness of the labour market is likely to return as we get through this. We've already seen expectations for peak unemployment in this cycle come right down below the level of the great financial crisis. Now, it's still too high. It's still going to be a problem. There's lots of transition support for us to do for people. But let's just remember that a lot of those people who are being dislocated this time are different to people who maybe lost employment in the financial services sector in 08 and 09, or in the manufacturing sectors in the 80s and the 70s. We're talking about people who are working in retail. I think we all think restaurants will still be a thing when we come back from this. People working in high street retail, well, they work in arguably one of the most flexible sets of employers that exist. They're used to working in a certain way. So as those people transition into growth areas, they're coming with a set of expectations that it would be wrong for us as employers not to try and meet. You add on to that the fact that the UK labour force is getting smaller. We're in the process of replacing the people who were born over the next decade between 1955 and 1965 with the people who were born between 2000 and 2010. I always shock myself. Both my children fall into that second class, which just makes me feel old. But there are just fewer people in the noughties decade than were born between 55 and 65. And we already know that we're likely to see less net immigration from Europe. So the whole piece that says talent is still going to be a squeeze after all of this. So if we're going to thrive through all of this, we need to start thinking about how we engage people with the jobs that we need to do. And some of that's about getting beyond processes that we've relied on for years. Bit of a stretched analogy. But this summer, we've had a really good and effective discussion in the HR community about the difference between being non-racist and being anti-racist following the murder of George Floyd and the Black Lives Matter campaign. And that's about not just having fair processes, but actively seeking to deliver diverse outcomes on the front foot. And I think the same applies to how we engage all of our talents. These are not sectional interests. This is about how we do business. So I think what the big role for all of us is to make the case that doing this well boosts productivity, resolves our skills shortages in an environment where the labour pool is getting smaller and there's lots of transition going on, and being willing to challenge the way we've always done things. You know, one of the reasons that we replicate our process is that we rely on things we've always done because they've always worked. The tree has been shaken. Maybe we pick up some of the apples that have fallen to the ground. And last but not least, just to re-emphasize your point, Emma, let's not confuse flexible working with home working. I think, like many people on the call, my experience of March, April and May was not working at home, it was living at work. It was possibly the least flexible period of my life when it comes to my working time as a working father. So let's just make sure we keep our eyes to the horizon on the whole gamut of what flexible engagement of really good talent is as we go into the recovery. And I'll finish on saying I'm a massive optimist on the potential of the British economy next year. So let's make sure we drive this agenda as we go.
Brilliant. Thank you, Neil. Really, really interesting. Particularly, yes, mirror in the context of how we're working now is not how we necessarily want to work in the future. Laura, Group Recruitment and Talent Director at Lloyds Banking Group, can I bring you in, please? To Neil's point, that there's really clear business incentives for doing this, both in terms of sort of talent attraction, but more broadly. I mean, Lloyds have been a significant champion of flexible hiring for many years, way before any pandemic or many others were sort of joining the journey. What can you explain to us? Why does it make good business sense for Lloyds to do this? And also maybe why do you think others aren't? What are some of the challenges that face businesses in trying to get it right that you have done?
I think it's a really interesting point. And actually, when Neil was referring to picking up some of the apples, it struck me as a working mum, I joined Lloyds Banking Group because I'd had a global career, and actually I now have 2 small children, and actually Lloyds offers the flexibility I was looking for. So it's interesting how you sort of sit and reflect and say, actually, this has been a real hook for me personally, and definitely reinforces the importance of flexible working in the workplace and attracting a diverse talent pool for sure. In terms of the organisation, I would say that really, one of the things that's absolutely essential, as you know, is that kind of real leadership from the front. So having that executive sponsorship of the importance of this, the kind of leadership from an executive member, really leading the organisation in kind of being bold, being committed to this agenda. And obviously then, all the policy piece that follows with that, the education and support for line managers. We are an organisation of over 60,000 individuals and a lot of leaders across the UK, predominantly UK. And actually, I do think we're an example of where actually you can do, you can equip line managers to have those conversations. I think there are also, I look after recruitment and talent for the group, and I think there are some real infrastructure things that organisations can do. Really simple things like once you've dealt with the policies and the processes and the guidance, the support, actually hardwiring it. Most recruitment systems now, you can hardwire that into all the job opportunities. That creates the platform on which for somebody to have that conversation. It gives permission, it gives endorsement to the individual that it is okay, it is good to have that conversation. We are open and we are keen to support people to work in a flexible way. And I think very much, as you say, agile working has been something that Lloyds Banking Group's been committed to for some time. But I think actually the pandemic, gosh, I think we've all had a very difficult year this year. And Neil, when you were talking about the spring, gosh, yes, I felt like that crazy person in the advert juggling the kids, the job, and everything else. But actually, what it has done is actually change consumer behaviour, which I think will also help, because if we think about our own behaviours, as people, we want a job and flexibility. As consumers, in the past, you've wanted to be able to go into your bank branch and talk to a real person, and actually kind of in terms of presence in the branch, that's meant for those staff that there's been a physical presence. The shift where now we've found new and different ways to deliver services, particularly in the service sector, I think has really challenged traditional outlooks on quite how much staffing we need in physical presence workplaces versus elsewhere. And not just on the home working, I think the kind of flexible shift patterns, we've all had to be very flexible around how we juggle all of our commitments, and much more fluid. And I think certainly senior executives are much more open now to being flexible because they had to be, there wasn't another option. So I think mindset shift will also accelerate further as well. But I think that the crux, as somebody accountable for recruitment and talent for the group, I think the crux point is creating and engendering in the culture, making sure that it is just part of your everyday discussion. When the recruiters are having the briefing with the line manager, they're exploring feasibility, they're making sure they're pushing the boundaries a bit in that conversation. Equally, when we're surfacing great talent and there's a shortlisting conversation, really pushing the line managers to think creatively about how could we make that work? What could we do? Maybe we can find somebody who will match that shift pattern and be more proactive and supportive of making it work, so that you can have that great talent in the role. So I think it has to be led from the top. It does. The real unlocker of really accelerated change is having executive sponsorship and real ambassador, driving commitment and making it happen. And then the rest is around how you create it through the infrastructure. I think it's going to be interesting as we go into a hybrid working environment where everybody wants, if you like, some flexibility. I think it's going to be interesting, and we had a brief conversation about this recently around the how we treat workplaces, because it's interesting, Neil, you were saying about the finance person being excited about the property portfolio and the possible kind of a cash access. Most buildings actually are owned often by pension funds, for example. So, the whole cycle is all interconnected. And actually, in terms of workplaces, most organisations have to make that really difficult call at the moment in terms of, are we going to wholesale shift? Are we going to keep an office, a real office focus, or are we going to go somewhere in between? And if we go somewhere in between, there is definitely a kind of place for government in this, because currently the HMRC's definition of days a week. Well, I think quite a lot of people will be right on that brink of, are they then becoming a home worker, or are they becoming a workplace person as a primary hub? And that there is, from a cost to the business point of view, a big decision maker, because the business can't afford to be paying for the office space for the odd occasion somebody's there, as well as paying the travel costs if they're technically a home worker. So I think also, government needs to lean into this and actually needs to make sure that they keep pace in terms of taxation and kind of rules around workplace, to help employers navigate this, so we can be as open and flexible as we possibly can.
Really interesting. Thank you, Laura. And absolutely, I think there's some big institutions that are playing catch up, government not being one, in terms of, I think, how we need, and the infrastructure that needs to sit around fundamentally how we're working differently. I think it's structurally, it's a really good point. And also your point about the recruitment process, from hiring manager through to resourcing, through to the actual vacancy, and what you say on it, I think is a really well made one as well, because we know it's, I mean, we have in the past talked about at Timewise the sort of risk of what we call flex washing, which is you just stamp something on a job ad, and then unfortunately it's a very bad candidate experience because the hiring manager isn't expecting them to ask for flexibility, or they haven't thought it through. So absolutely the importance of building that through. No, thank you.
Sorry, I was just going to say, it does have to be led by the executive sponsor and the kind of policy piece, because I think, and the kind of guidance and support before you do the infrastructure. But equally, once you've done that, I think kind of that just opens the door to the conversation and gets it on the table.
Thank you. Laura, Laura EY, can I come to you now? So so we've talked about kind of the sort of broader piece around the need to rethink how we're working. We've talked around the kind of leadership and the cultural piece, and then the process we need to put in place. EY have again been champions of flexible hiring and flexible working for many, many years. I'm interested in your reflections on how you can avoid the sort of just that kind of risk of kind of flex washing, of sort of making a statement, how a brand needs to present itself in a way that is authentic and real when it comes to flexibility, because clearly I think there's some unintended consequences again here that, you know, if based on what we've lived through, if we see a statement that says open to flexible working, we may all automatically think, oh my God, that's 70-hour weeks, back-to-back Zooms. That's what I understand as flexible working, and that's not necessarily what I want to do. So be really interested in just your reflections on how you sort of take that approach far more culturally and from a brand perspective to make sure it feels right.
Thank you. Yeah. So I think firstly, as you mentioned, from an employer brand point of view, this year has given companies an opportunity really to sort of revisit their EVP. So in this like remote or maybe part remote model, what does the employee and candidate experience look and feel like now? And is the brand content actually still as authentic as it was before the pandemic? So perhaps if remote working is new, you know, for an organization, are the employees supported and trusted during their experience of it? And how might that change the conversation in the market about what it's really like to work for your company? So I think that's the first thing to consider. At EY, you know, we advertise all of our roles as open to flexibility, and we first piloted a flexible working scheme back in 2012. So we've really worked on embedding that, you know, into our culture, whether that's on a formal or an informal basis. But you're right, it's so much more than just about job ads. So it's not an add-on, it's building it into the roles. We've adapted workspaces, invested in all the tech, you know, and trained managers to support flexible working from entry level all the way up to the leadership team. So it becomes just the way you do business. And I think, as Laura said, you know, about Lloyd's, it's an opportunity to think more creatively when it comes to designing jobs and empowering the recruitment team to challenge the business about ensuring that new job roles are open to flexibility. So I think that's really key, is getting that authenticity and having that challenge at every level.
Sorry, I'm muting also now. Thank you. I think as we are, as job seekers, just expecting it to know that it's real and it's authentic, and exactly it's going to be a good candidate experience throughout that process, and then it's going to be what you expected it to be when you join an organisation is clearly really important. Thank you, Laura. We've got 20 minutes, so I'm going to bring Claire in, who is Timewise's Programme and Consultancy Director. Hello, Claire. And would like to now open it up for anybody who may have some questions or comments or reflections for the panel. So myself and obviously Neil, Laura and Laura, if you have questions for us in relation to experience of flexible hiring, in relation to the index, or in relation to the role of the recruitment industry really in this space, then please do let us know. I think, Claire, we've had some questions already in advance, haven't we, as well?
Yes, I had the first one I had was around, you know, in the index it looked at senior roles and junior roles, and the observation being that, you know, there seemed to be more part-time at junior levels but less part-time at senior levels. And I'd be very interested, maybe from both Laura's, how do you encourage part-time in senior roles? Because we know there's a huge appetite there, and yet we still see very few jobs being advertised. Laura, Lloyd's, shall I come to you first?
Thanks. Yeah, I think, you know, it is, you know, let me speak personally as an executive, I think it is more challenging in the senior roles. You know, the nature of the roles are, you know, the job is the accountabilities, and it's the coverage of the accountabilities and the kind of always on nature that means that you've got to find somebody to partner with you. And we have a number of examples in Lloyd's executive population where we do have successful job shares in that space, but that who is, you know, of equivalent kind of expertise, capability, can be a kind of really strong partnership, can work effectively together, you know, men and women. But I think that it's finding that fit to make that successful. And I think at more senior levels, I would say that ultimately for that to be successful, you do need to find that really strong partnership, because it's very unusual in an executive position that it could be purely one person part-time, because the accountabilities typically are, you know, might be regulatory accountabilities, might be, you know, span of control accountabilities for a particular area of the business. So you can't have a gap in those accountabilities in the period of time when somebody's in that position. So but I think it can be done. And interestingly, it's interesting the question, because actually I think increasingly, you know, people are raising it, you know, people are more forthright about what works for them. And, you know, certainly I can say I was very forthright about, you know, the terms on which I would work, and I work flexible hours, and actually that's what was important to me in going into this job. And so I think it's encouraging people to have the confidence that if you're the right person for the job, then you have a conversation about the hours, the pattern that you'll work, and how you'll make sure those accountabilities are discharged responsibly. But I think, you know, increasingly there are a number of really great examples. Certainly I can think of several in our executive population where actually that works really well. But it does require, I would say, you know, real thought and proactivity on the part of the individuals to make sure that that's going to work for the business, and we're being responsible with our accountabilities.
Yeah, thank you. Emma, there's a question for you around methodology. Could you just clarify? Yeah, I know we've excluded poor quality roles. Does that include things like 0 hours contracts? Could you maybe just touch on which roles were in and out of scope in our index?
Yes, so we have excluded 0 hours contracts because we consciously wanted to look at the ratio of permanent and flexible roles. We know if we included 0 hours, it would sway the data, because we know there are a lot of 0 hours, and the focus for what we want to look at is how many quality, or at least decently paid, permanent roles are there in the market. So we start on the basis of London Living Wage, and we work upwards from that, because clearly everybody is aware that the issue at the bottom of the labour market is there's a significant trade-off with the wrong kind of flexibility in temporary contracts, and that wasn't necessarily what we wanted to focus on. And also we recognise there's a lot of other analysis in relation to 0 hours in the marketplace.
Neil, this might be one for you, I think, to give us a view on, which is if a job doesn't specifically reference flexibility, should you go for it, and when should you mention it in the process? What would your advice be?
So some of this is about not kind of outsourcing that decision onto the candidate, and that's one of the reasons why it's really important that companies get onto the front foot. But if you are looking at this, you know, it's all, you know, the job finding the recruitment process is like any other deal. You have capital, and so does the employer, in finding the right balance. If they want you, they will move if they can do. So I would always say people should throw their hat into the ring, demonstrate that they can do the job, and in the process of that discussion then say, but I'll need to do it like this, otherwise it doesn't work for me. I'm sure you'll be more successful than Boris in negotiating a complex deal, but there's one thing I would encourage. We speak for 3,300 recruitment businesses in the UK. Do have a discussion with the recruiter as well once you get into the process about what the possibilities might be, because there's a big difference by coming in and saying, I want to work flexibly, and coming in and saying, look, I know what you need for this job and it's these things, and I can match up against it by doing this, this, and this. So apply some thought process to what the arrangement that might work for you both is, when you'll know more, obviously, as you're going through the selection process.
Lovely, thank you. Laura, other Laura, EY, what do you think is the most important for resourcing teams and hiring managers to know and understand to kind of really embrace flexible hiring?
So I think probably the most important thing is the opportunity it brings for diversity within the business. So, being able to flex to candidates' needs means that we can really consider the best talent and the best people that are going to drive the business forward and help us grow, and bring that diversity of thinking as well that makes us successful. So I think for us that's the way the conversations would usually go if we were discussing that with a hiring manager, is thinking about how can we get the best person for that role, and how flexible can we be to do that.
Lovely, thank you. Emma, we've had questions about both construction and NHS, and how do you make flexible working work in those sort of sectors with frontline roles?
Yes, interesting. So I should say, so at Timewise we run an innovation unit that specifically looks at how we can enable greater flexibility for people in frontline environments, because we know it's really complicated. First thing I'd say is we look at flexibility often when we talk about it in the market as how much, when and where. And obviously there's lots in a policy that relate to that. I think in a shift-based environment, we need to be thinking slightly differently. It's about input, advance notice and control. It's a different axis. We call it shift-life balance, which is often the opposite of flexible working. People need fixed working. They need to know when they're working, and they need to make sure they have some control over that flexibility. So Matthew Taylor, in his report for the government, talked about two-way flexibility, and it's about making sure you can get that right. In the construction sector, we're running a pilot at the moment with 4 major firms. We'll be sharing findings in the spring, but we've certainly seen, pre-COVID, it's been a sector that's been challenging when it comes to flex. Over this period, they've had to adapt. But I think one of the things that we are helping our partners to do is to think about how you can give men in particular, as well as bringing women into the sector, that level of control. So it's whether it's staggered start and finish times, it's whether it's thinking about if you are having to be on an actual site, making sure that you can be as efficient as you can in terms of how you work at a team level. And it's also about thinking about the preferences piece, and it comes back to the manager point, which is good construction sites are now starting to make sure that managers are asking people for their preferences and actually enabling teams to be able to have that level of input into how they can choose their shifts and work it out between them, is a really, really valuable thing that we can do on sites. But have a look on our website, there's more information, or please do get in touch. On the NHS, it's very similar. It's about thinking about, we've been doing a lot of work with nurses on wards in a number of hospitals. We did a big pilot, same in social care, how we can help teams think about that input into your schedule, so that you don't have just a week's notice or 2 weeks notice if you have your own care responsibilities, but you can plan your life, your day, your weekend. And there are some really interesting examples, some of ours and others, around what we would determine as team-based rostering. And I would urge to have a look on our site, or actually Claire, who leads on that work, to get in touch. But I think the point is it is possible in frontline roles. There's a big difference between having the same outcome for everybody. You need to have a fair process, and then it's really clear that we can offer flex in every role, but it will be a different kind of flex depending on the industry you're in.
Lovely, thank you, Emma. Laura from Lloyd's, I think your video cut out just before when you were talking about home worker definitions and how many days someone needs to be at home to be considered a home working. So maybe a quick recap on that. And I've had a question which links, which is, you know, at what point would you switch someone's contract to being a home worker? And, you know, what's the kind of implications of that?
Thanks. So I think it's a topic that certainly most of my counterparts are dealing with at the moment. I think most of big organisations in the UK are wrestling with this one. So I'm not going to profess to have the silver bullet, but I'll certainly cover my kind of view on the situation. So as we know, because of the pandemic, most people want to have more flexibility in terms of where they work and increasing their home working proportion. One of the challenges at the moment around that is twofold. One is obviously most companies have a property portfolio. And obviously, if the individual is going to be at home considerably more, they need to rethink that property portfolio. Yes, there is the upside that Neil referred to in terms of finances if they release some, but they also need to work out what proportion do they need to retain for the days that those individuals are in the office. And the nature of that is variable, not fixed, right? So that's quite a difficult conundrum for the business leaders. Plus, they need to consider things like making sure they've got sufficient oversight of what's going on in the organisation, particularly if you're in a sector like ours where you need to make sure you're responsible with people's money. But also they need to think about creating communities and kind of colleague engagement and how much contact and what nature of space they need. That's on the kind of business side, if you like. From the individual side as well, connected to that point, it depends on how much people want to work from home. So as I was saying, one of the things that's a very live issue for us at the moment is, you know, the HMRC's guidance around what constitutes a home working is typically around a 3-day-a-week rule, tipping point. And actually a lot of people now are looking to that 2-3 days as a real tipping point for people. So interestingly, I think that almost that needs reviewing as well in terms of what will constitute home working, because they're inextricably linked. If an organisation is going to retain its office, it's not going to make people's home location home, because they've got to keep paying for the building, so they're not going to pay for travel expenses to the workplace. Equally, if they're going to shift it to home, then they need to contract their business portfolio presence, and that has all sorts of ramifications, not least of which because most assets in the UK, buildings wise, would be owned by pension funds. So it's sort of all is in a cycle connected to everything else. So it's not a simple one. There's a lot of minds wrestling with it across the UK, across most businesses at the moment. But it's certainly something that as we move towards a more hybrid way of working, everyone is trying to solve for, to try and meet the needs of colleagues as well as meet the needs of shareholders and business owners. So hopefully did that come through clearly that time?
Very well, thank you. And other Laura, there's been a question around onboarding, and I think this is someone a lot of organisations are grappling with at the moment. So as we look ahead to hybrid working, you know, how is EY starting to think about, you know, how you will welcome and induct new joiners in who are working in a remote or hybrid way?
Yeah, this has been a challenge for us since March. You know, the majority of our new joiners have joined from home, and obviously that's required some kind of technical adjustments in terms of getting equipment to them and things like that. But I think most importantly, it's really making sure that they feel that they're supported and that they have the resources and the people that they need around them from day one. So, you know, from a content perspective, my team has worked really hard to put together content that helps new employees to feel that, you know, they've got all of the information that they need. And then our line managers also have, you know, had support and training on how to make that successful. So that's definitely been one of the more challenging areas to contend with, I think, during the pandemic. And you know, some of our new employees may not have met their teams yet, so then it's also, well, in person obviously, so then it's also, you know, making sure they will remain engaged during that time.
Thank you very much. Lovely. Emma, do you want to say a few words? I'm conscious of time.
Yes, absolutely. We're trying to be time wise. We know how much Zoom you all do. We would advocate, please, for people to have 10 minutes break between Zooms. It's good for well-being. I know it's not always possible. But can I just say thank you so much to our panel, to Neil, to Laura, and to Laura, for your insights, your thoughts, your reflections. Thank you for Claire. Thank you to you all for joining us. Just to say, there's been huge change this year. I think we've debunked the assumptions that you can't work flex around trust and performance and productivity. That's gone. The reason to say no is gone. I think the challenge now is, how do we embed this? How do we sustain it? How do we look forward? And how do we make sure that we are as open to candidates who are expecting it now as well as needing it as we are to our employees? So I hope you'll all take some insights away. Please do read our report, and have a good rest of your day. Thank you very much.